Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 6, Chapter 1, The Life of Ajamil. And this is verse 50. This is the Srimad Bhagavatam as translated with commentaries by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, Founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And this is the continuation of the discussion between the Yamadutas, agents of Yamaraj, who have come to take Ajamil to the hellish planets to be punished and prepared for a lower birth due to all the sinful activities he's committed. And the Vishnudutas, who suddenly appear on the spot and prevent the Yamadutas, agents of Yamaraj, from taking Ajamil to the hellish planets. And the Vishnudutas are the servants of Lord Vishnu. So this is bewildering to the Yamadutas, because according to their instructions and their understanding from what they've heard from Yamaraj, who is a pure devotee, Mahajan, servant of the Lord, that those that are sinful like this need to be punished. So the Vishnudutas will begin to explain eventually why they're stopping Ajamil from being taken to the lower planets, and why calling out, like Ajamil did, the holy names of the Lord was sufficient to protect him from Naraka, the hellish planets. Even though he was very, very sinful, and he wasn't even calling out. His intention wasn't to call out for the Lord. He was calling out the name of God because he had named his son Narayan, which is the name of the Lord. So this is a conversation between these different servants. So the Yamadutas are continuing here to defend their position and their understanding of why they should be taking Ajamil to the hellish planets, Naraka. And they continue. Above the 5 senses of perception, the 5 working senses, and the 5 objects of the senses is the mind, which is the 16th element. Above the mind is the 17th element, the soul, the living being himself, who, in cooperation with the other 16, enjoys the material world alone. The living being enjoys 3 kinds of situations, namely happy, distressful, and mixed. So the Yamadutas have a very, very good, in-depth understanding of how the material world is working. And they have perception of the difference between spirit and matter, obviously, because they're describing the situation of the soul, which is a spiritual particle that is now embedded in material nature and has taken on repeatedly over and over again different material forms to accommodate the material desires. So we have here the 5 working senses, the 5 senses of perception: eyes, nose, ears, tongue, and sense of touch. These are the 5 sense perception, 5 elements of sense perception. And then the 5 working senses are the legs, the arms, the genitals, the anus, and there's one more. Perhaps in the purport, Prabhupada will enlighten us what the fifth working sense is, but they are working senses. And the five senses, objects of the senses, which are for the eyes, is sight and seeing, and is fire, I believe, form, and then the ears is hearing, that travels through the ether, and then sense of smell, the nose, which comes from the earth, and sense of taste travels through water, and that's for the tongue. And then sense of touch is I believe air. Air is a sense of touch. And that the organ for that is the skin. So, those are the 15. It's the objects, the senses for perception, the working senses, and the objects of the senses. And above that is the mind, which is considered the 16th element. The mind is engaged in serving these other 15. And then above the mind is the soul, the actual living being, the spirit spark, who is using these other 17 elements to try to engage in the material world, to enjoy controlling things in the material world, trying to experience pleasure through material senses and the mind. And this enjoyment is controlled by the three modes of material nature. Everything is under the jurisdiction, and so there are three modes of enjoying, three modes of activity. For everything in the material world, there are three modes. So here the three modes are being discussed in terms of this last sentence, which the living being enjoys three kinds of situations. Happy, mode of goodness. Distressed, mode of ignorance. And mixed, mode of passion. There's always those three. You have the outer extremes this way, the outer extremes that way, and then something in the middle. The three modes of activity. I wonder if it could be compared to, like in mathematics, you have the bell curve. There's the extremes here, and then in the middle. It's in terms of probabilities. So many calculations are made in the material world based on this bell curve. One extreme here, and then in the middle. Prabhupada's commentary: everyone engages in work with his hands, legs, and other senses just to achieve a certain goal according to his concocted ideas. One tries to enjoy the five sense objects. Okay, so the sense objects are form, sound, taste, aroma, and touch. So form is perceived through the eyes, sound is perceived through the ears, taste is perceived through the tongue, aroma through the nose, and touch through the skin. Not knowing the actual goal of life, which is to satisfy the Supreme Lord. Because of disobeying the Supreme Lord, one is put into material conditions. He then tries to improve his situation in a concocted way, not desiring to follow the instructions of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Nevertheless, the Supreme Lord is so kind that he comes himself to instruct the bewildered living entity how to act obediently, and gradually they turn back to Godhead, where he can attain an eternal, peaceful life of bliss and knowledge. So, we see that in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Testament, the example of Adam and Eve. They were instructed not to do a certain thing. And because they were disobedient, then there was, they had to be removed and put out. Otherwise there would be a disturbance. So this obeying the higher authority is absolutely necessary for the living entity to be peaceful and happy. So it says, because of disobeying the Supreme Lord, one is put into material conditions. Okay, so of disobeying the higher authority, the Supreme Lord, because the living entities are eternal, they have to go somewhere. They can't be allowed to remain in peaceful, harmonious existence in the spiritual atmosphere. So, because of that rebelliousness or that tendency to disobey and want to exercise minute independence, then some facility is provided, and that is the material world. But the Lord is always sending representatives and instructions, and he comes himself to try to get these disobedient, inimical spirits back into at least recognizing the value of obedience at whatever level. Some of these modern day programs, some of these 12-step programs, where people are addicted to different things, either drugs or alcohol or overeating or sex mania or whatever it is they're overcome by. It's called addictions, where they become obsessed with these things, and drags them down into very miserable conditions and death also, diseased condition and death, very, very unhappy situation. So the very first thing toward a sign of making progress in overcoming these addictions is to recognize a higher authority. It's kind of a generic approach to at least a higher power, something higher than myself. So those living entities who are addicted to trying to control the material nature in many different ways, the Lord is there to try and help them to experience what happens when someone does accept a higher authority, a bona fide higher authority, somehow representative of the Lord. Not a cheater, but bona fide either through the scriptures or through a bona fide representative, or even within the heart, accepting that there's something more than just what I'm experiencing with my material senses and my mind. So by accepting a higher authority, then they're on the path to becoming cured. Because the ultimate high authority is Krishna. So when we think about these sinful people who have to go to Naraka and go through these hellish punishments, drinking molten iron and embracing red-hot objects and suffering thirst on a place where there's no water and everything is red hot and hot, everything's hot. Then being boiled alive, being so many things. You can say that they're being forced to accept a higher authority. They didn't ask for this situation, but now they're in it. So there's something higher than themselves. If that's the only way to do it, then that's the only way to do it with the stick. They can't hear good instruction, and they can't see how it works by observing around them, then I have to get there's a higher authority, and you're going to get very, very uncomfortable until you recognize there is a higher authority. So it's one of the understandings of hell. It's not just, I enjoy punishing people. It's really good. Yeah, let's see them squirm. No, it's not. It's not that kind of thing. It's, you can't understand anything else. So you have to get this so that at least you can recognize there is a higher authority. Like sometimes with people, with alcoholics, you can talk good advice till you're blue in the face, they will not listen because of the addiction. And there's a terminology that sometimes they just have to hit bottom. It has to get so bad, the suffering, the misery has to be so intense that with an inch of their life, basically speaking, their last breath, somehow or other, they make the decision that they have to improve their situation somehow. They need help. Can't do it themselves. Which means accepting a higher authority. So this Naraka, these hellish planets, so horrible, so horrible, so horrible. So there may be that element to it also. At least you have to see you're hitting bottom here. Now you have to go from here, you have to go up. This is the bottom, this is worse, as worse as it can get. You have to turn around. You have to take some help somehow. So then they get another opportunity, another material, gross material body. And unfortunately, it usually isn't a human form. If they've been very, very sinful, then they will have to take a lesser form and work their way back up through the wheel of samsara till they get opportunity for human being again. So, Hare Krishna, it's the way it works. But the Lord is so kind, He's making arrangements. And what can be done with someone who is determined to disobey, determined to cause a problem all the time? What can be done? Well, it has to be done like this. Nevertheless, the Supreme Lord is so kind. He comes Himself to instruct bewildered living entity how to act obediently, and then gradually return home back to Godhead, where he can attain an eternal, peaceful life of bliss and knowledge. The living entity has a body, which is a very complicated combination of material elements, and with this body he struggles alone, as indicated in the verse by the word ekastu. For example, if one is struggling in the ocean, he must swim through it alone. Although many other men and aquatics are swimming in the ocean, he must take care of himself, because no one else will help him. Therefore, this verse indicates that the 17th item, the soul, must work alone. Although he tries to create society, friendship, and love, no one will be able to help him but Krishna, the Supreme Lord. Therefore, his only concern should be how to satisfy Krishna. You see people try to take shelter of friends or society or family members. They try to take shelter in this way of other people. But ultimately, how can anyone else really help that person? That person has to revive their own relationship with Krishna. That's the way to actually help someone, is to constantly remind them of Krishna. If you actually want to help somebody, you help them to remember their own relationship with Krishna and not become falsely dependent on each other when they really can't help each other. Ultimately, it's like trying to enjoy these different relationships materially is like, I heard an example was funny. When you go to the lower depths of the ocean, you have to be outfitted with a special diving suit. It's very bulky. It looks like an astronaut suit, actually. And it's got the big helmet on, and there's a tube that goes back to the ship for the air and the oxygen. And in that way, it can go to stay down longer and go deeper into the ocean. So if two of these divers are there, these deep sea divers are there, and they want to have a relationship, how can they're in these diving suits in an atmosphere that's foreign to them, that's why they have to have these special suits, because they can't just so material body is like that, and the material energy is like a giant ocean. So people are trying to have these relationships with each other, but what can one do for the other? Each one is in their own diving suit, deep sea diving suit. So they have to get out of the material ocean altogether and get rid of that deep sea diving suit and get the original form, the spiritual form. For example, if one is struggling in the ocean, he must swim through it alone. Although many other men and aquatics are swimming in the ocean, he must take care of himself because no one else will help him. Therefore, this verse indicates that the 17th item, the soul, must work alone. Yeah, at the time of death, they have to go to Krishna. Who can help? Therefore, his only concern should be how to satisfy Krishna. This is also what Krishna wants. Sarvadharman parityatya mamikam saranam vraja. People, bewildered by material conditions, try to be united, but although they strive for unity among men and nations, all their attempts are futile. Everyone must struggle alone for existence with the many elements of nature. Therefore, there's one only hope. As Krishna advises, it is to surrender to him, for he can help one become free from the ocean of nescience. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu therefore prayed, Ayinantananuja kinkaram patitamam vishame bhavam buddha kripaya tavapada pankaja stite dili sadarisam vichintaya. O Krishna, beloved son of Nanda Maharaj, I am your eternal servant, but somehow or other I've fallen into this ocean of nescience. And although I'm struggling very hard, there's no way I can save myself. If you kindly pick me up, fix me as one of the particles of dust at your lotus feet, that will save me. So there it is. There is no way I can save myself. If I could have, I would have, long time ago. There's no way a person can save themselves. Save and except to surrender to Krishna. but then you're not really saving yourself. Krishna's saving you. So once we turn to Krishna, and Krishna is very, very eager. Krishna is just waiting for that, for the living entity to turn to him. He's just waiting for that. So and he is sending his representatives to serve him like that, to bring the conditioned souls back to Godhead. In a similar way, Bhaktivinoda Thakur sang, Anadi karma pali padi bhavanava jali taribara nadiki upai. Dear Lord, I cannot remember when I somehow or other fell into the ocean of nations, and now I can find no way to rescue myself. We should remember that everyone is responsible for his own life. If an individual becomes a pure devotee of Krishna, he's then delivered from the ocean of nations. We should remember everyone is responsible for his own life. The devotee is engaged in serving Krishna. He's helping everyone. By engaging in Krishna, there's no separate endeavor needed. Simply engage in Krishna's service, and everyone is benefited. There's no sense running around pouring water on the leaves and branches of a tree. You pour water on the roots, then the whole thing flourishes. So just serve Krishna under the direction of the pure devotee, spiritual master, and his representatives, sincerely following. Then everything is taken care of. And if an individual becomes a pure devotee of Krishna, he's delivered from the ocean of nations. Text 51. The subtle body is endowed, so this is the Yamadutas continuing. They have very good understanding of the modes of material nature. The subtle body is endowed with 16 parts, which is interesting because they are representing this knowledge. And they're going to hear from the representatives who represent a higher knowledge. Devotional service, the knowledge of devotional service and the potency of the holy name. So these philosophies are personified in these persons. So when we hear them speaking, these Yamadutas, they are the embodiment of this philosophy. They fully understand. And that is very interesting because we heard previously that there were three of them, three of these Yamadutas, each representing different aspects of the material entanglement, one representing the body, one representing the mind, and the other representing words. So that is very interesting there. So they're continuing to speak. The subtle body is endowed with 16 parts. The 5 knowledge-acquiring senses, 5 working senses, 5 objects of sense gratification in the mind. The subtle body is an effect of the 3 modes of material nature. It is composed of insurmountable strong desires, and therefore it causes the living entity to transmigrate from one body to another in human life, animal life, and life as a demigod. When the living entity gets the body of a demigod, he's certainly very jubilant. When he gets a human body, he's always in lamentation. When he gets the body of an animal, he's always afraid. In all conditions, however, he's actually miserable. His miserable condition is called samsriti, transmigration in material life. So within the subtle body, there are the aspects that are connected to, that eventually come out into a gross body. So it's endowed with 16 parts. The subtle body, there's knowledge acquiring senses, 5 working senses and 5 objects for sense gratification, and the mind within the subtle body. When you get a gross body, it's a manifestation of the mind, of the desires in the mind. And they're propelled by insurmountable strong desires. And that's what causes living entity go from one gross manifestation to another. And again, we see 3. We see human life, animal life, and demigod. A kind of happiness in demigod, and kind of moroseness or lamentation in the human body. The animal body, just fear, always afraid. And this transmigration in material life is called samsmriti. Prabhupada's commentary. Sum and substance of material conditional life is explained in this verse. The living entity, the 17th element, is struggling alone life after life. The struggle is called samsmriti, material conditional life. In Bhagavad Gita it is said that the force of material nature is insurmountably strong. Davyesha gunamayi, mamamaya duratyaya. Material nature harasses the living entity in different bodies. But if the living entity surrenders to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it becomes free from this entanglement, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Mam ivaye prapadyante, mayami tam tarantite. Thus his life becomes successful. Again, the path out of this samsmriti, cycle of samsara, is surrender to Personality of Godhead. Text 52. The Yamadutas continue. The foolish embodied living entity, inept at controlling his senses and mind, is forced to act according to the influence of the modes of material nature against his desires. He's like a silkworm that uses its own saliva to create a cocoon and then becomes trapped in it with no possibility of getting out. The living entity traps himself in a network of his own fruitive activities and then can find no way to release himself. As he's always bewildered, and repeatedly he dies. Oh yes, we see that. We see that on an individual scale and on a grand scale. You can see what's going on in the different societies in the world at present. Trapped by the modes of material nature, a strong desire to try to enjoy everything, performing so many sinful activities that are actually bringing on death, contaminating the planet, misusing resources, violating nature. So many diseases are coming, and it's not what you would call sustainable path. The way the activities are going is not sustainable. So the more they continue on, more bewildered they become, and then there will have to be a reset. Just like the individual soul becomes entangled in material desires, is so strong, gets a gross material body to try to act out the desires that are there within the mind, becomes more and more entangled in sinful activity, becomes trapped by it, and then that gross body perishes, and they have to begin it all over again, repeatedly. So we see that with civilizations come and go also, so-called civilizations. Without the goal being to please Krishna, either on the individual level or the collective level, then the only thing that can happen is this entanglement, bewilderment, and unsustainability. And it has to be wound down and then start all over again. Prabhupada's commentary has already explained the influence of the modes of nature is very strong. The living entity entangled in different types of fruitive activities like a silkworm trapped in a cocoon. Getting free is very difficult unless he is helped by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Text 53. Not a single living entity can remain unengaged even for a moment. One must act by his natural tendency according to the three modes of material nature, because this natural tendency forcibly makes him work in a particular way. Modes of material nature. According to one's desires, then the modes the desires are there, cannot remain inactive even for a moment, and that activity is directed according to the modes of material nature. And so he has to act in a certain way, according to his desires. Can't remain inactive, is full of desires, and those desires are conducted under the authority of the modes of material nature. Goodness, passion, or ignorance. So I have to act. We read previously, even against his desire. A person may not want to do something, but like Arjuna says in the Gita to Krishna, what is it that forces a man to act? Even if he doesn't want to, somehow he's impelled to act, even according he doesn't want to. And Krishna's answer is lust only. So that lust is very deep-rooted. And even if with the intelligence a person knows something is wrong or there's going to be a bad reaction, they may helplessly, they can't, it's too powerful, and they may act on their lust or greed or whatever, even though they know it's wrong. Without consciousness of Krishna, this lust is situated in the mind, and forced to act, as if helplessly. Prabhupada's commentary. Swabhavika, or one's natural tendency, is the most important factor in action. One's natural tendency is to serve, because a living entity is an eternal servant of God. The living entity wants to serve, but because of his forgetfulness of his relationship with the Supreme Lord, he serves under the modes of material nature and manufactures various modes of service. Socialism, humanitarianism, altruism. However, one should be enlightened in the tenets of Bhagavad Gita and accept the instruction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead that one give up all natural tendencies for material service under different names and take to the service of the Lord. One's original natural tendency is to act in Krishna consciousness because one's real nature is spiritual. The duty of a human being is to understand that since he is essentially spirit, he must abide by spiritual tendency and not be carried away by material tendencies. It's very attractive, actually, to try to do, humanitarianism work, people are suffering, and we should open hospitals and schools and help them so they're not suffering. That's all right, but if that's the only reason to do that, then it's a material activity, and the benefits do not reach the ultimate goal of spirit. To have peaceful life is not just for the sake of having peaceful life so one can enjoy their senses peacefully. It's peaceful life so that one is not constantly in a state of fear or anxiety and has the time and facility to develop their Krishna consciousness and devotional service, to hear and chant and render service, remember, offer prayers, and develop their Krishna consciousness. And then the material activities will be minimized. Because the people will be making decisions based on spiritual truth, not based on unlimited consuming and sense gratification. Well, that's where the problem's coming from. But there's a certain kind of attractiveness and makes you feel good to help with education or welfare work like this. But it misses the mark. Only devotional service can actually get one completely out of the jurisdiction of the modes of material nature. The mode of goodness is a good platform, but not just to stop there. Prabhupada continues, however, one should be enlightened in the tenets of Bhagavad Gita and accept instruction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead that one give up all natural tendencies for material service under different names and take to the service of the Lord. One's original natural tendency is to act in Krishna consciousness because one's real nature is spiritual. The duty of a human being is to understand that since he is essentially spirit, he must abide by the spiritual tendency and not be carried away by material tendencies. So either good or bad material tendencies. Like bad material tendencies are illicit activity, lying, cheating, stealing, intoxication, addictions, whatever. These are bad material tendencies. Try to gratify one's senses through these sinful activities. But similarly, to try to find some pleasure or happiness by performing pious activities. That is also not recommended. Not be carried away by this tendency to act on the material plane, but to learn how to engage on the spiritual platform under the direction of the bona fide pure devotee spiritual master. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has therefore sung, Maya Vase Achabese Kachahaba Dubupai. My dear brothers, you're being carried away by the waves of material energy. They're suffering in many miserable conditions. Sometimes you're drowning in the waves of material nature. Sometimes you are tossed like a swimmer struggling in the ocean. As confirmed by Bhaktivinoda Thakur, this tendency to be battered by the waves of Maya can be changed to one's original natural tendency, which is spiritual, when the living entity comes to understand that he's eternally Krishna Das, a servant of God, Krishna. Drowning in the waves of material nature. So we're going to be in an ocean. We're either going to be in the material ocean, being tossed and turned, and struggling and battered by the stormy waves of the material energy under the direction of the modes of material nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance, or we get to swim in the spiritual ocean of ecstatic love of Godhead and devotional service. So that swimming is going to be there. The swimming is service, like serving. We're either going to try to serve in the material energy, which brings no real peace or happiness, because everything is temporary. It's of a temporary nature. It's continually being created and annihilated, coming and going. There's no permanence. And there's no real satisfaction for the soul. Or we're going to serve in the spiritual world, serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, and realize our own spiritual nature. And become blissful and happy. No beginning, no end. Transcendental bliss. When the living entity comes to that, to understand that he is eternally Krishnadas, a servant of Krishna, God, Krishnadas Evishvash Karlitara Dukhanai. Instead of serving Maya under different names, one turns his service toward the Supreme Lord. He's then safe. There's no more difficulty. If one returns to his original natural tendency in the human form of life by understanding the perfect knowledge given by Krishna himself in the Vedic literature, one's life is successful. So what is the difficulty? The difficulty is identifying with a temporary material body and mind. That's the difficulty. And where does that come from? It comes from desires in the mind. And where does that come from? It comes from disobeying the higher authority, acting independently, under the illusion that one can enjoy independently, without consideration for the source, one's own source. Honor thy father and mother. Materially, your father and mother, you have to honor them. Spiritually, the father and mother. Krishna and the Vedas. To honor them. The bull and the cow. Text 54. The fruit of activities the living being performs, whether pious or impious, are the unseen cause for the fulfillment of his desires. This unseen cause is the root of the living entity's different bodies. Because of his intense desire, the living entity takes birth in a particular family, receives a body which is either like that of his mother or that of his father. And the gross and subtle bodies are created according to his desire. So fruit of activities are the cause for the fulfillment of desires. Because of these fruit of activities, a living entity gets different bodies. So they were discussing that earlier, how the reason we have the body that we have now is because of the fruit of activities we engaged in a previous life. And similarly, the activities we're engaging in now, fruit of activities we might be engaging in now, will determine what material body we'll get in our next life. That's why we want to engage in spiritual activities, because then we don't get material desires, and we don't get a material body. We return back to the spiritual world. It's the whole idea. It's the whole program. In a nutshell, it's not difficult to understand, but it's extremely difficult to surrender to it. Prabhupada's commentary the gross body is a product of the subtle body. Yeah. Just like the material spirit is the cause of matter. You think material scientists have it backwards, that matter causes consciousness. No, consciousness produces matter. So the mind, the desires in the subtle mind, produce the gross body. Yam yam vapi smaran bhavan jyante kalevaram tam tam evati kantaya sadatad bhava bhavitaha. Whatever state of being one remembers, when he quits his body, that state he will attain without fail. Oh, Krishna. Hare Krishna, please. Oh God, if for some reason I don't remember you, you please remember me. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Oh God. Ah. The atmosphere of the subtle body at the time of death is created by the activities of the gross body. Whoa. Are we getting this? Oh my goodness. At the time of death, according to the activities that have been performed with the gross body during that lifetime, that will determine the atmosphere of the subtle body. Oh boy. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Oh my God. Govinda. Thus, the gross body acts during one's lifetime, and the subtle body acts at the time of death. Krishna. Anyone who thinks that this isn't science is in the biggest darkness. This is transcendental science. The subtle body, which is called linga, the body of desire, is the background for the development of a particular type of gross body, which is either like that of one's mother or that of one's father. Okay, so whatever one remembers at the time of death, that state he attains. And what one remembers at the time of death is determined by the way one acted in that lifetime. The activities one performed with their gross body then determine the atmosphere of the subtle body at the time of death. Well, that's pretty simple. Act like eat anything and do anything. At the time of death, the state of the mind has the desires that would be more suited for a pig body than a human body. Always engaged in illicit sex without restriction. State of mind of the living being is either like that of a monkey or a pigeon or something like that, because they have so much sex every day, all day, 5, 10, 100 times an hour, who knows. A lot of activity like that. So pigeon or monkey, because the state of the mind, according to the way the person acted, determines the atmosphere of the mind. Very envious, maybe a snake or something like that. A snake is very envious. It strikes for no reason. Just because you move, the snake will strike. So we're going to get some information here, it looks like, about how the actual child is formed. According to Rig Veda, if at the time of sex the secretions of the mother are more profuse than those of the father, the child will receive female body. If secretions of the father are more profuse than those of the mother, the child will receive male body. These are subtle laws of nature which act according to the desire of the living entity. If a human being is taught to change his subtle body by developing a consciousness of Krishna, at the time of death the subtle body will create a gross body in which he will be a devotee of Krishna. Or, if he is still more perfect, he will not take another material body, but will immediately get a spiritual body and return home back to Godhead. So how detached can become in this lifetime is determined by how attached to Krishna he can become. Body, mind, and words. That's like the sannyasi. He has the 3 little sticks on top of his danga. Body, mind, and words. Body, mind, and words. Servant of Krishna. This is the process of transmigration of the soul. Therefore, instead of trying to unite human society through pacts for sense gratification that can never be achieved, like the United Nations, it is clearly desirable to teach people how to become Krishna conscious and return home back to Godhead. This is true now, and indeed at any time. So these activities are taking place. This is it's like peeling away, covering, and getting real knowledge about what's really going on. The process of transmigration and what the goal of life really is. So these organizations for trying to make agreements how they're going to help each other to live peacefully with sense gratification are very foolish. It's very foolish. It never works. It never works. Because sense gratification without the goal of Krishna consciousness has the seeds of its own destruction sown in, become more and more entangled. And there are always disagreements because each person is alone. They try to make these arrangements for sense gratification. They don't work. At some point there's disagreement and discord because they don't have the common center. If the common center is simply sense gratification, that's like in a marriage, it's Griyamedi. But if the common center, like in a marriage, is Krishna, then it's Grihastha, spiritual life, for the advancement of all the family members. So that's the same way in the larger society also. And in any gathering of people who are trying to work together for betterment, from whatever angle of vision, it has to be in terms of service to Krishna.